All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rebecca Thistlethwaite. I am the program manager for the Niche Meat Processor Assistance Network. We are an extension-based community of practice for small and niche meat processors and meat producers from around the country. Our mission is to scale up sustainable meats and help the local and regional meat industry thrive. So today's topic was generated from our listserv. We have a listserv of about 1,400 members, and they get to ask questions of each other. And there continue to be questions regarding sort of the nuts and bolts and the logistics of kosher and halal slaughter on our listserv. And I realized that we just really didn't have the expertise in our group to answer these technical questions. And so I put out there to the group if folks would be interested in a webinar on this topic, and they resoundingly said yes. And then I said, who would be the best person to speak to this topic? And we were lucky to find the world's foremost expert on religious slaughter, who is a professor emeritus at Cornell University, Dr. Joe Regenstein. Hopefully I pronounced his name okay. I'm going to let him introduce himself because he has a lot of material to cover today, and his background is pretty impressive. So instead of trying to tell you everything that he's done, I'm just going to let him pop right into it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to let him share his slideshow. Oh, a couple housekeeping issues. If you have a question during his presentation, please pop it into the Q&A, and we will save about 15 minutes at the end of his presentation for questions. We're also going to email his slideshow to everyone who participated in this webinar. So if you can't take notes quick enough, don't worry, because we're going to send you the slideshow. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll pass it off to Joe.
Good morning to most of you. To a few of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. It's certainly my honor to be asked to do this, and I am looking forward to it and sharing some information. As a professor emeritus, I've had a long, wonderful career here at Cornell, but I think the most important things are that I've, throughout my career doing research and teaching in extension, have also been involved in Cornell's Kosher and Halal Food Initiative. And as part of that, starting around the year 2000, became much more involved in animal welfare and humane slaughter issues, having participated both in the Food Marketing Institute, which really means supermarkets, all the supermarkets, in their animal welfare efforts. And hopefully many of you will look at the American Veterinary Medical Association's Humane Slaughter Guidelines, which is a new document to join the Euthanasia Guide, which includes a section on kosher and halal, but also covers almost every animal you can think of, including a few of the minor animals like rabbits and ostrich and things of that sort. Oh, okay. Just to start out with the closest I've ever found to some humor for this topic, which is not a humorous topic, but I thought this might at least highlight a little bit of an attempt. To start with, I just want to go through quickly where, whoops, I hit something wrong. Clearly haven't done enough of this. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. I'm still learning this technology. Obviously, animal welfare is important, but I think it's also important to keep in mind public health, the environment, impact on workers, which we don't always think about, and economic efficiency. And all of these need to be considered when we are working with animals in a commercial practice. And again, as a food scientist, my goal is to have good food which meets the needs of people, both as part of their community and as individuals. I like to start with the law. We do have a Humane Slaughter Act. It discusses the way you can slaughter mammals, four-legged animals. It does not cover poultry. It gives a number of ways of doing it. The traditional ways are not what I'm covering today. The important part is that according to the United States legislature, signed by the president, that has determined that slaughter in accordance with the Jewish faith or any other religious faith is humane. And that is the use of no interventions prior to a cutting of the neck. In 1958, unfortunately, the Muslim community was not well represented. They certainly should have been identified directly. However, in this law, and this is an important point which I'll come back and forth to as we go through some of the more technical details eventually, is that the ritual slaughter and the handling or other preparation of livestock for ritual slaughter are exempt from the terms of this chapter. In practice, this has meant that the immediate pre-slaughter interventions, the restraining device, the getting the animal in, has technically been exempt from good handling practices, which is unfortunate. The bubble has been, it's called a bubble, and it's exempt from secular authorities. And the reason I say it's unfortunate is there is no reason why that had to be exempt. Good animal handling practice actually helps make kosher and halal slaughter better. It really works across purposes. And in modern times, the religious leaders have kind of realized that and are on board for working with the government and the plant and the experts like Temple Grandin and many of her students in trying to do this right, though there is certainly room for improvement. That, as exempt by, or as declared humane by the government, doesn't mean that everybody in the Muslim and Jewish communities wants to or will require that the animal be slaughtered that way. Within the halal community, there is a major debate between those who accept a pre-slaughter intervention, which we normally think of as stunning. I don't like using the term stunning and unstunned. I think it polarizes unnecessarily, but I will have to use it to just simplify things as we try to cover a lot of territory. A major characteristic of an acceptable stun for those in the Muslim community who do accept stunning is that it must be reversible and it must not kill any of the animals. And that reversible, not kill any animals, is fine in a laboratory. I've seen very nice pictures of 3 short-haired sheep with brand new electrical equipment in a totally dry, clean animals. And yes, it is reversible if you use the right voltages and current amperages, but you can't really do that in a regular plant. And so there's been more and more pushback from many Muslims on that form of slaughter. The 2 types that are used to a very limited extent, the non-penetrating stunner is used. It is permitted by Malaysia, which is one of the stricter Muslim countries in terms of enforcing halal regulations. And they actually show photos in the regulation of just how much skull cracking you can do. The most common in those which do permit it is electrical stunning. And one of the concerns that has arisen there is the question of whether the animal is really unconscious or only immobilized. And that comes out of work in humans with electrical shock therapy. You can get a situation where a person has been shocked and is totally rigid and cannot move, but when they eventually come out of it, they actually report that they were feeling pain and that it was not painless. And so, again, the use of electrical stunning in a reversible form is of some concern, and that carries on into its use in other applications within the food industry. But again, I'm focusing on kosher and halal at this point. Again, to give some practical numbers as a kind of a framing and to set what kind of ways we do this is the traditional cattle lines in the large plants are running 385 an hour. So that's kind of a benchmark number I use. There are a few on the kosher side, nobody accepts pre-slaughter interventions with the animals. However, some of the liberal Orthodox rabbis will accept post-slaughter stunning. And that is widely used by one particular company, and I'm going to mention its name only because it is a truly national company, which is Hebrew National. The animals for them are killed on a special equipment designed by Temple, and we'll talk about some of the design aspects as we go through this. And that with post-slaughter stunning can reach 215 head per hour. However, most slaughter in systems with either without the post-slaughter stunning, the restraint box, which I will show you shortly, is about 85 an hour. With shackling and hoisting, which was being done in Latin America, it is highly objectionable. We certainly, for cattle, there is no excuse for hanging a live animal. And our goal, meaning Temple and myself and others within animal welfare slant, is to also eliminate it for things like sheep and goats, though it is still clearly being practiced in some of the smaller abattoirs in this country. And some folks, both in the Muslim and Jewish community, want the animal upside down, and for that purpose, they will get about 55 animals, again, cattle per hour. Again, we're making a point of that shackling and hoisting is not ideal. It can be covered by the bubble, which is why it's been protected. We'd like to see it go. One of the things that one needs to think about vocabulary carefully when dealing with religious slaughter that is not always necessary with traditional slaughter is the distinction between unconsciousness and total loss of reflexes or, excuse me, insensibility. So before an animal can even be removed from a restraining box, and that is how we strongly recommend doing it, it should be unconscious, which means that it has lost the ability to maintain posture, to right itself, etc. It means it no longer feels pain. You can hang it, but you are not supposed to do any dressing procedures until it has lost all of its reflexes, things like eye roll and corneal reflex, which on Temple Grandin's site, grandin.com, you can find a lot of that information. So in religious slaughter, unconsciousness comes time-wise before insensibility. So the animal can be hung to free up the equipment. It cannot necessarily be processed immediately. And here I just give a formal, when the animal has collapsed, it's unconscious. When it's lost all the reflexes, mainly the eye reflex, we believe that to be the equivalent of brain death, and therefore you can begin to process. I do want to point out again that both religions have a long history of animal welfare, and when you think about what some of the rules I'll share with you were 3,000 years old, both of these religions were way ahead of Western society in how they killed animals. And again, I want to make it very clear that I work with the religious community to improve this, and there is room for improvement as there is in regular slaughter. And a couple of important points just to frame it. Rebecca will have a more detailed article that gives you a much broader overview. I'm really focusing on slaughter. But again, the meats are an exception, but the rest of the foods, kosher and halal, are not about blessings. It is about following a very detailed set of legal rules. The religion, you can talk about God, you can talk about the Bible and all kinds of religion, but in a practical sense, it comes down to a set of regulations similar to the Code of Federal Regulations. You do certain things, and the rabbi or the imam is a third-party auditor. And so they will, particularly with slaughter, you will certainly have to have people from the appropriate faith on which you're doing your slaughter. The big difference between the two groups with respect to blessings, and the only blessing related to food is at the time of slaughter, is the Muslims want and do a blessing over each animal immediately before slaughter, while Jews do a blessing over a batch of animals. In both cases, the normal procedure is for people to be of that religious faith and to be fairly strongly practicing in order to do slaughter. The laws themselves cover a lot of things. We're going to go through this quickly. It is in the document I hope Rebecca will circulate. The allowed animals for kosher are ruminants that have a split hoof and chew their cud. And I've listed a few. For halal, it's non-carnivorous animals. The camel is a ruminant, some of you might be thinking, but it does not have a clean foot split hoof. It has padding. And the rabbis have ruled that's not acceptable. Rabbit is acceptable. Horse is controversial in the Muslim community. Some accept it as questionable, and some reject it. So again, one also has to recognize that any one person tells you what they're doing may not be 100% acceptable by everybody in either of the two communities. Both communities have differences within the community that affect what is done. With respect to birds, what I call the traditional domestic commercial birds, chicken, turkey, goose, duck, are kosher, but not the ostrich, emu, rhea family. Halal accepts those. Again, there are other birds that are accepted. You need to check when it comes, if you're raising game birds or slaughtering game birds, there's some real disagreement, and one of the most controversial is something like pheasant. There's a real split, at least on the kosher side, with respect to pheasant. The really important point that gets to the heart of what we're doing in religious slaughter is the prohibition of blood. It is the life fluid, and both of the two religions have always taken that very seriously and wish to have maximum loss of blood. And in both cases, it's a cut across, a horizontal cut across the neck, and we'll define that a little tighter further on. Muslims slaughter and turn the animal back over to the secular authorities. The only thing that's of importance to them is the slaughter. This is not true for kosher, and this is where the two really, really diverge. For kosher, it is after the animal has been slaughtered, there's an inspection of the animals in situ, in the animal after slaughter, mainly the lungs, and the person who does that is a bodek. The meat then goes into the cooler, and sometime thereafter, within a fixed time span, the meat has to have certain veins and arteries removed, and the sciatic nerve, which is a commemoration of Jacob's bout with the angel. And removing the sciatic nerve is difficult, and the tradition in European Jewry is that they didn't do it. Those coming from North Africa and the Middle East do still do it. It's a lot of work, so even there it is not always done because of the cost. The person who does that is a menaker. The person who does a slaughter, I realize I don't have up here, is a shochet. Often a person is trained to do all three, particularly certainly the first two, and we'll talk about the details shortly. And following that, there is a soaking and salting and rinsing of the meat to remove more blood. So there's a whole bunch of activities that are going on that are beyond the immediate slaughter. You may be asking, well, what if things don't pass? All of that meat, as long as it passes USDA inspection, can go into the secular supply. So as a practical matter, 70% of the meat coming out of a kosher slaughterhouse is going into the secular supply. On the Muslim side, if all goes well, 100% can go into the halal system. And again, just as a side note, any animal-derived products must come from either a kosher animal for the Jewish community or a halal animal for the Muslim community. So many of the ingredients we use in food processing need to also pay attention to the slaughter. Here is a picture of a ASPC upright pen. We'll look at the head holder in detail. There is a pusher gate in the back, and there's actually, in many of these, a lift underneath the animal that is not meant to get the animal off the ground, but simply to help position it. So this is equipment that is where you can get about 80 head per hour, 80, 85 head per hour. This is a picture of the lung adhesions. This is what the rabbis mainly are focused on. It's not the only thing, but this is the thing. And so what they're wanting to do is when the lung cavity is made available, and that means you have to dress the animal differently for a kosher inspection, the bodek will actually put his hands in the cavity and see if there are any signs of these lung adhesions going across from the lung to the lung cavity. And they will then have a piece of paper with the picture of the lung and mark where they found them, because once the lungs are out, they have to do it again. So, and this is not considered a defect from USDA's point of view. There is interesting data that came out a year or two ago suggesting in large-scale cattle kill that when they kept track of animals that had lung adhesions and animals that did not have lung adhesions, the animals without lung adhesions were 15 pounds on average greater weight than the ones with lung adhesions. So it has a small role in yield, but is extremely important in determining if an animal is kosher or not. This is a very highly technical skill that the bodek has to determine if each of these is a showstopper for kosher. The glot kosher, which is the word you may have heard, is simply that they won't even look at the animal in detail with the lung out if there are more than 2 of these adhesions. Again, in modern high-speed production, it is just simply they worry that things will be rushed and not done well, and so they simply ruled, and that really came out of the United States, that if the animal kind of has 2 of these lung adhesions called sirchas in Hebrew, the animal will be not accepted for glot. In some plants, it is then re-inspected by a different rabbi who may choose to accept it as regular kosher. And so there really are 2 levels, and in some plants, both levels occur. In other plants, and certainly for those of you running small plants, you will have to either get a rabbi who's willing to sort the meat into glot and non-glot and be respected for that decision, or you may have to choose to be glot or regular kosher. And again, that defines your market. There are many other laws. Again, please look at the paper to get this in context. I'm talking very much out of context by focusing just on the kosher slaughter, kosher and halal slaughter. Again, for many of you in the audience, your reason for doing it is the right reason. It is a business. If you can make money, and be more efficient in the use of your facility, then you should do it. And so unless you happen to be of either of these two religions and are doing it for something related to your religion, the rest of you, it is perfectly fine. It's a business. One of the important things that Temple's work has shown is that the outcome in working with these animals, because they are not stunned, or is that you want calm animals. And so a lot of the tricks that she has of, you know, animals have to get used to people, people will scare them if they've never seen a person, and a person on a horse is not a person. From a cow's point of view, it is a two-headed animal that they only see in the feedlots. Equipment and procedures and management and training are all part of running a good kosher and halal practice. And again, one of the things that Temple has been a wonderful role model is in being sensitive to the requirements of the religious community. Unfortunately, some of the animal welfare folks in Europe feel that they can just tell the Jewish and Muslim community that this is how you're going to do it. Sometimes they have the law on their side, but that's clearly not how to make things successful. Who can slaughter? In the Jewish community, it has to be an Orthodox Jewish male who has been trained both religiously and can do, and they need to do both. Their secular training in terms of animal welfare and things like that probably could use some improvement. The EU has tried to begin to address that. It is something we are interested in. One of the things we've learned is that the more aggressive the cut is, the better it is. You are allowed to go back and forth continually, but a good aggressive cut, which in fact is something the Muslims in general do much better, is something that we need to try to get to happen more. There's also a correct place for this knife cut, and the data from Temple and others suggests that the closer you are to the top of the allowed region, the better the results. And there's some technical issues that are beyond, again, the scope of this talk. Muslims, both male and female, can slaughter, though commercially I've only seen Muslim slaughtermen. If you are operating in halal, you really need to keep track of the calendar, and you really need to make sure that you are aware of the two holidays that really every family wants to have a freshly slaughtered animal, generally a sheep. These holidays move because they're on a lunar calendar with no adjust. So this year, Ramadan is coming. Tentatively, everybody's using May 6th as the start of Ramadan, which is the month of fast. So somewhere around June 6th, I haven't checked the calendar, you will have the Eid festival after Ramadan, and that's when you will have this intense pressure to slaughter lots and lots of animals. For kosher slaughter, because of the specialness of the knife, and we will talk about that, you need to check the neck of the shochet has to check the neck of the animal, and if it's not clean, it needs to be washed. And we encourage washing ahead of time, and for sheep, we also encourage a little bit of shearing at the neck, so when the shochet has to get to the neck, it's not going through wool, which will mess things up sometimes. Again, one of the keys if you're working with these people is not for them not to feel that you're pressuring them for speed and trying to rush them. They need to do this in their own pace. This is a halal knife that we designed based on some of the work of Temple and some of the work in the Jewish community, with the knife twice the length of the width of the neck. So this is for a small animal. It's a big knife. It's straight, and that's important. This is a restraining box plans are up. The next slide will have the URL. This was designed with Temple's help. It uses Temple's double rail. The sides are solid, so the animal cannot be disturbed. And it's a non-slip floor that's dropped. And as you can actually watch the animal calm down as you drop the floor, and it's being supported by the double rail. It is a fascinating thing to see how well this type of small restraint works. It can be built by a typical person who knows how to use a welder, which is certainly not me. This is my favorite picture. My wife's jealous of being kissed by a goat, and Spirit of Humane is the website that has this. There is controversy over upside down versus upright. We strongly prefer upright, meaning Temple and her students and myself, but there are some who will insist on upside down. That kind of equipment is certainly more expensive. For small plants, you probably need to think in terms of marketing from the upright position. It is acceptable in the NAMI guidelines. I still have the AMI terminology, but it is acceptable to do it. I was able to explain to everybody why it really was needed. And some of the Muslims also want that. The knife is very special. I've talked about it, but the point I want to make, and that's where we're working with the Muslim community, who are very positive. They're working with us very well. But the important point is the knife has to be very sharp, and it has to have no nicks. And the no nicks is what a shochet spends a lot of time making sure is the case. It is not the case in the Muslim community, and it's been not the case in the research community, particularly in Europe. So the knives that they are using are not comparable to a kosher knife. And it's a real skill, but it is one you can learn to find all the nicks on a knife and to get rid of them. I've talked about the aggressiveness, which I'll skip anything further. However, one of the things I would like to see us work on is the ergometrics of the handle for where one is killing a number of animals. The Jewish knife is poorly designed ergometrically. I do believe that upside down and right side up, we may actually want to slightly change the ergometrics of the knife to help make those more useful. A key development in recent years has been the development of a knife sharpness testing instrument. This instrument, the knife goes down along the slider on your left and cuts through a film, and the force allows you to see the knife. And this is a typical knife that so-called sharp, but you notice it's, first of all, it's round, so people actually end up not sharpening the two ends. And you can also see that it's relatively noisy. And we'll come back to, which is probably means it still has nicks. These are three knives, actually it's two knives, three situations. The bottom knife, the brownish orange line, is the knife I showed you in the picture. The top knife is a Jewish knife that a shochet put through the equipment. The end effects are an artifact because the knife is too big for the equipment, so we had problems at the two ends. You'll notice it's the sharpest of all these knives, and more importantly, it's very, very smooth. And we believe that some of the noise you're seeing is the nicks. I don't know that they're all of the nicks, and I don't know that all the bumps are nicks, but we certainly know that that knife is very different from the knife below. That knife was sharpened by the shochet for 20 minutes. And when we forced him because we needed to move on, he put it in, that's the middle blue line. He said, this knife I would not kill an animal with. You'll notice it is much sharper, but it's still much noisier than his knife because it still had nicks that he hadn't worked out. So again, the knife is extremely important. There are some detailed rules for slaughtering kosher. The one that's important is the no pressure, and that's why Temple has designed a special head holder to deal with these problems. Again, there's a proper spot we talked about, and the head holder also goes along with the no tearing. If the neck is too tight, tearing could occur before the cut. So these need to be optimized. Again, I think I've covered most of this in terms of working with the Muslim community. We're hoping to get some video of really good knife sharpening and showing also working on training for the nicks. Temple has put a head holder together that has all the properties it needs so that the slaughterman can get to it, that it is the right tension, though we're actually rethinking whether we need to adjust the tension, and then it does need to be released afterwards. And this is an example of that head holder where the neck cutting area is kept separate from the metal because you don't want the knife interfering, running into the metal or the metal interfering. Again, we really actually think that we probably need a little less tension to be sure that things are working correctly. One of the issues with this kind of slaughter is time to unconsciousness and time to insensibility, and the two need to be separated. The consensus seems to be that the time to unconsciousness ought to be less than 40 seconds. If an animal is not unconscious in 40 seconds, it probably should be traditionally stunned. So one should have available a traditional stunner. Poultry, because I know some of you, I believe, are in poultry. Sometimes it is held and cut, and sometimes it is hung and cut afterwards. Some people use shackling. Shackles, the smaller plants generally use a bleeding comb, which we'll see in the next picture. Again, gas is not acceptable for any animal or bird in both communities. I guess I'm sorry, the cones will come a bit, come a few slides. Again, just to go through a little more detail, animals need to be calm. The equipment has to be good. The shochet has to, and more Muslim needs to check the knife. The shochet checks the neck. The cut is made. The shochet will put his thumb at the cut point. Done properly, it does not elicit pain. To make sure it's been cut properly, you then need to wait till the animal becomes unconscious, to hang it and insensible before you cut it. The animal can be removed from the restraint once it's unconscious. Again, hearts and lungs are left in for kosher. The bodek inspects internally. Lungs are removed, kept separately, but have to be ID'd so they can be related back to the animal. And the lungs are inspected externally, which requires an air pump and a water bath. They basically remove those sirchas according to the official procedures and then put it in the water bath. If there's a hole in the lung is not acceptable. So it's a little bit like you do a bicycle tire. The ribs, somewhere in the system, the rabbinical people will carve in the ribs, which is a way of authenticating the animals that are kosher. If it's done before the animal is cooled, it cannot be done afterwards and look the same way. So it's a way of traceability. The meats that have been identified as kosher, halal, and or not kosher halal need to be stored usually on separate rails. There needs to be a good procedure for keeping track of what is what. Deveining is done on the front quarter, and I've spoken that 70% is secular. The soaking and salting and rinsing is often done at the meat plant. And again, as a small operator, you may need to set up to do that so your customers are prepared to purchase the meat. They're not set up at home to do this. And this all has to occur within the first 72 hours. If not, there are special procedures which are covered in my paper. Poultry, again, we talked about the holding. The key here is for kosher, you cannot scald. And so, in fact, the better thing to do is very cold. You can't go above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, but in fact, if you're going to put the bird, particularly chickens and turkeys, you put it in ice water. In larger plants, the pre-chiller can be used for soaking, and the chill tank is used after salting. The salting actually occurs between the pre-chiller and the chiller in poultry. Poultry is almost, nobody buys poultry unsalted these days. So that's an expectation pretty much of the consumer. And here now are the cones. You can kill and then put it in the cone for bleeding, or you can put it in the cone, put its head through the bottom of the cone, and do the cutting at that point. So this came from a small halal facility. I want you to read this on your own because I want to leave time for questions. The important point is that done properly, Temple pointed out that the super sharp blade with no nicks does not freak an animal out. It is not a source of pain if done right. Again, in reading the literature, one of the things that frustrates me in the European literature is people use bad equipment, bad knives, and then they blame it on the religious slaughter. One of the things I ask of everybody who might go in this is please do it right so that, in fact, we can maintain our right to do it because we're doing it in fact, a humane and appropriate way. And there is equipment that simply should not be used, and I identify one that is in that category. I think I've talked about the post-slaughter stunning, so I think I've hopefully done it within a reasonable time, right on time. Just leave this up for a minute to think about, and hopefully you will work with our communities to help us have different options for the meat we need to eat. And here are some resources. The paper is the one that Rebecca has. There are some stuff similar to a more general talk on this thing called Cyber Tower. And for those who really want to do something intensive, I do teach a distance learning course at Kansas State University. And with that, I look forward to Rebecca organizing us for Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. I do have a few questions that have come in. Jessica Rusa asks, my understanding of the data is that religious slaughter takes about 3 times more time. Is that correct? Or is there some sort of figure that you have?
The figure I gave, it's certainly at 80 animals an hour, you're at about a third of the speed of a high-speed modern Cargill or ConAgra type of Tyson slaughterhouse. It is definitely slower. Now, again, if you're doing a small-scale kill, a lot of those are often slow already. It's not clear to me, and I do not have any hard data in a small slaughterhouse, how much slower the process would be.
Yeah, and sort of along those same lines, I'm curious what kind of premium like a small plant could charge, because there is quite a few more things involved in this. Do you have any ideas what small plants might charge as a premium?
That's a very interesting and, of course, controversial question, but a good one. The halal market has unfortunately at times been extremely price sensitive, and people have kind of gotten the product they're selling to be similar in price to the secular product by using lower quality animals. The Muslim community needs to accept that for what they want, if they're going to have it, there are some upcharges, but they're fairly small. They probably will accept, I would guess, maybe 5% That's been a problem. The kosher market is used to paying a premium. And again, the assumption here in a small plant is that it's more custom and that they're special animals, so there's a premium there, and then that there is a significant premium for kosher slaughter. I don't have a hard handle on a percentage, but one can go, one would probably check out on the web, and you'll find that the price of kosher meat, hopefully comparing apples and apples, is still much more expensive. Now, one of the things we're exploring is the question of the fact that 70% of kosher meat does not end up in the kosher market. Different Muslim groups accept different levels of Jewish slaughter and how they want the individual blessing said. So we did do a truckload of sheep and goats in a small plant in the Midwest. I was not there, but I had been involved in setting this up, where the Jewish slaughterman said the Muslim blessing out loud and was assisted in the slaughtering and handling by a Muslim from one of the communities, and they then accepted all the non-kosher parts that passed USDA inspection as halal meat. And so the question has come up, and there are three ways that seem to be acceptable for how do you say the blessing. Some Muslims are perfectly happy having the Jewish slaughterman say the blessing, for which there is no question they are allowed to do it. And if they push back, please send them to me, and I will talk to them in a language they can understand. It's really been approved. The other procedure is, in some cases, the Muslim will be touching the Jewish slaughterman and the Muslim says the prayer, and some are even willing to accept the fact that the Muslim stands next to the Jewish slaughterman and says the prayer at the time of slaughter. And that allows you to get a small premium for halal and a bigger but reasonable premium for kosher, because unfortunately sometimes the non-kosher meat from the kosher plant gets slightly downgraded because it's not the whole animal, etc. In the large-scale commercial, again, the assumption here is that in a small plant you would sell that to your regular customers, and of course the hindquarter is the more desirable cuts. Now, I did work with the plant that I spent my 60th birthday in the blood pit measuring time to unconsciousness and insensibility. And what they actually did is put on product. They were doing natural product. I mean, it was coming in with special farming, etc. And for their natural product, they put on traditionally hand slaughtered. And I would argue that for people who do like to patronize small facilities, some of them would appreciate the fact that this is done in a much more respectful way than traditional slaughter, with a religious person saying a prayer, doing it as part of a religious obligation.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, when you say only 30% of the animal is considered kosher, can you explain that?
Well, the front quarter, in practical terms, is prepared for kosher. The hind quarter is not. Mm-hmm. The question then is, what is the percentage of animals with lung adhesions?
Oh, yeah.
And the key here, though, and this is, again, I realize most of you, at least from Rebecca, are USDA, and that's one thing. But even then, one of the challenges is if somebody says, I have one animal or two animals that I want to kill kosher, there is the question, what happens for that person if they've hired you to do kosher and the animal does not pass kosher inspection? One of the things we're working on, and we're not ready for its use in small plants, is the question of using ultrasound. You can do lung ultrasound. You can't guarantee the animal will be kosher, but you sure as heck can eliminate some animals that are not kosher, that are simply have lung adhesions and are unlikely to pass.
So one of our attendees is a veterinarian, Michelle Fannin-Steele, and she said that lung adhesions are pleuropneumonia from shipping disease. So it's actually a disease?
We have had many discussions and many arguments about this. There are multiple, it appears, and again, I'm not a physiologist or a veterinarian, though I've obviously worked with AVMA. There is not agreement onto the source. My guess, based on listening to people all state what is the cause, is that there are multiple causes. And some of it is early pneumonia. Temple feels that in some cases it's dehydration. Some people feel it's shipping. But again, if you look at animals on the farm, you will find some of the animals have, again, with the ultrasound, I believe we can show that some of these animals have it on the farm. Obviously, cows, dairy cows, are not used in kosher because, in fact, almost all of them have lung adhesions. And so, again, I don't know what transport, again, from a meat's point of view, I haven't monitored because we don't worry about them for kosher. We simply don't use them because almost all of them will have lung adhesions by the time they go to slaughter.
Another veterinarian chimed in and said that they can be infectious, trauma, dehydration. So it sounds like there's a long list of what can create that.
Right.
I'm going to move on to another question from Nelson. Are you aware of any differences in cleaning or sanitizing agents in religious slaughter?
That's a fine point, but yes, there are issues, particularly on the kosher side. In terms of what is being done in modern times as direct interventions on the carcass. The carcass at the time we normally intervene, which is somewhere either, I think, just after the washer. So you're talking about sides and beef. I'm thinking of beef and sheep. You've got sides of animals. They go through a washer, and they sometimes then, either before or after, actually, in the plant, get some sort of chemical treatment. Some of those chemical treatments and the use of steam have religious issues, and some are permitted by the rabbis and some are not. Another issue along that same line is the question of electrical stimulation of the carcass. Some plants stimulate the carcass, and that has also been questioned by some of the rabbis. And the logic, because of course the animal is dead, we're not dealing with a slaughter issue, we're dealing with what impact does that have on the soaking and salting, which will happen afterwards. And so some of these are accepted and some are not. So you can't just do it anyway. The other thing to focus on from the halal point of view is they will not permit, generally speaking, the use of a plant that also does pigs. And to clean up after a pig kill, if they allowed it, can be quite extensive. On the kosher side, because everything is cold, the cleanup, which there is in kosher, some very complex cleanups, but for a meat plant, those are there's really just a good traditional cleanup because everything is cold. If you're doing anything with hot, like you want to use a scald tank in a poultry plant that was used to scald regular birds, and now you want to scald, in quotes, because I actually recommend ice water in that scald tank, cleaning that tank might require some special supervision by the rabbis.
Okay. I mean, could you use like a lactic acid or peracetic acid wash or anything like that?
The acids are specifically the ones that are questionable,
Mm.
because there is a whole category covered a little bit in my paper called kavush, which is how things that are kosher become unkosher by contact with a material of concern, which normally takes, in a cold material, takes 24 hours, but if it's an acid, it takes 18 minutes. And it's that concept of acid kavush in Jewish religious law that has led to some of these acids being of concern. And sometimes, in some cases, it may be the percentage of it. You may be allowed to use it at less than 1.6%, but not above 1.6% in your solution. And that's a magic number. It's really 1/60, which is a value for dilution that the rabbis have for general issues of how do we look at something as being an integral part of something. And so again, that will be very much dependent on the rabbi or rabbinical group that you're actually working with.
Okay. Jessica says, our typical process is to lift and shackle after insensibility. Because the cleric is bleeding the animal on the ground, we are thinking we can gain speed by not shackling, but rather placing lamb on skinning cradle. Our current hoists are only 32 feet per minute, so it is a slow process. We would like to stun several at a time. The USDA says we can have no more than 4 laying in weight of skinning. Is there a reason for this given number? Kind of a complicated question, but.
I actually have it in front of me. This is a USDA decision. It's probably somewhat arbitrary and capricious. What they're worried about is animals laying around and not moving along, and carcasses sitting there while you're doing things. This is a constant problem that special situations in kosher and halal and other kills need to be negotiated, either with the state inspector in state inspected states or with the federal inspectors. Much harder at the federal level. That's one of the places where there's more hope at state if you're using state level inspection. I don't think there's anything in the regulations that require it. I know that we've gotten certain exemption permits. You'll see halal poultry with an exemption permit because they don't detach all the parts that we normally do. We had to work with the state inspectors in one of the states. Muslims wanted to use sheep stomachs, and the inspectors were uncomfortable with that, but with education and discussion and procedures being established, we were able to get it so that those organs would be made available.
Mm-hmm. Jessica has a few more questions. We've been told that it would be misleading to sell halal meat to the secular community. Is this correct?
Halal meat generally goes as halal meat because they use everything. The issue is actually on the kosher side more than on the halal side. It's an awkward issue. I personally believe that all meat should be identified with how it was killed. One of the things that bothers me is there are 4 forms of secular slaughter: invasive stunning, non-penetrating stunning, penetrating, electrical, and gas, oversimplified. They're treated as if they are equal. They clearly are different. If consumers got all the information of which of these, how their animals were killed, I would want to put in that it was kosher or halal. But as long as we're not telling consumers how the meat is killed, why are we singling out religious slaughter unless it's a form of prejudice?
Yeah, that makes sense. We're going to go over the hour just a few minutes because I want to answer the last few questions. Jessica also says the USDA keeps asking for a letter from the religious authority. They have not provided a regulation requiring this. Do we need a letter for each individual religious authority?
This is, again, one of these awkward issues. Because the USDA puts the wholesome seal on the product, they have a stake in the product. And the way they have handled the religious is the way Jessica is indicating. What they want the plant to do is to prove that they have a religious authority and have such a letter. Now, again, when she says from each individual authority, it is suggesting that multiple authorities. Again, it should not be individual slaughtermen. That is not the requirement. Any one of the certifying agencies has, the ones that do meet, generally has a collection of slaughter persons, slaughtermen that they use. So that those slaughter people are all under that one organization. I do know of one plant that did have a duck plant years ago that had multiple organizations. And again, if they're putting the seal on of an organization, which you normally would put on a product, who is saying it is kosher or halal, then the government has to be comfortable that, in fact, that's not fraudulent. So again, if you use the general term kosher and halal, which many people will reject it, I don't think it's good marketing to do that. Again, even anyone's authority is not going to certify that they're doing the plant all the time if you have multiples in there. So in that case, I do think it's a reasonable request to be able to demonstrate that what's going out is marked as halal or kosher has been supervised, whatever the standard, and neither the USDA nor I want to judge the standard, but that somebody is taking responsibility outside the plant for that.
Yeah, and that would also interface with the labeling, because if you're going to make a claim or have a certification on your label, you have to get that approved. So you would have to send that paperwork of the certifying agency to the USDA label approval folks.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
A couple more questions before we close. Michelle Fanningsteele asks, do you know of kosher backgrounders or feeders who are doing BQA programs and tackling incidents of shipping disease or other things causing lung adhesions?
At this point, most of the plants that I'm familiar with are buying open market. So again, one of the issues, and that's why the weight loss difference at least is a leverage for the farm side to at least think about, is there ways that they could do a better job? Without that leverage, as I say, most of the plants are doing open market. I know that some people are beginning to look at the question of how do we have a more dedicated herd to increase our percentage of successful kill, because that clearly changes the economics. If you can go from roughly 60% glot to 70 or 75% glot, the market numbers change dramatically.
Also, are the plans for the small animal restraint available?
There should be up on the Spirit of Humane website.
Okay.
And that's one word, Spirit of Humane.
Okay. And I should say that we will send not only this slideshow, but I'll send links and also the paper that Dr. Joe is referencing to everyone who attended. Okay, so I'm going to take one more question. Could you explain reverse stunning again and its significance?
For Muslims, stunning has to be reversible. That means the animal appears to be stunned, unconscious, and it has to be able to come back to life. And that can be clearly demonstrated. I've seen beautiful video of it but it was video under ideal conditions. And so some Muslims kind of accept that if you can show it with a few animals, they can do it. Some insist on a Muslim being stationed in the plant just before the slaughter to determine that the animal is unconscious but not dead. It is permitted by many. Interestingly enough, in some of the export countries, it apparently was the industry and the governments who accepted it. And as pressure has been put on the Muslim communities with Islamophobia and attacking the non-intervention slaughter, Muslims became aware that the meat they were buying had been pre-slaughter intervened, and they've actually rejected it. So there's really good data in the UK that, in fact, the average Muslim consumer, and I would suspect that the consumers, that those of you who are doing small-scale slaughter, where you're looking at customers who've gone out of their way to be your customer, they're going to want unstunned non-intervention slaughter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like the big push is in the EU, right? To do the
Right.
pre-stun. Well, we are over time, and this has been an incredibly informative webinar on a topic that I knew nothing about. So I'm really pleased to learn more about it, and it's definitely changed my mind on some things. So I really appreciate it, Dr. Joe. Again, we will email this to everybody, and along with the papers that he was referencing, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you, Dr. Joe.
Thank you all for participating, and please feel free to write me if you have questions.
Thank you.